Before we start this podcast, I'd like to mention a charity that is very close to my heart, Auditory Verbal UK. Our son Henry was diagnosed profoundly deaf at 7 weeks old, and we worried that Henry would be isolated, ostracised, and lonely. Thankfully, we were told about auditory verbal therapy and how innovative and effective it was, and we signed up right away. AV UK supports parents to turn every single moment of every day into a listening and speaking opportunity. So successful is their therapy that by the age of 4 and with the aid of cochlear implants, Henry was talking on a par with hearing children and attending mainstream school. That transition from the first diagnosis to being a chatty, confident, gregarious 4-year-old boy felt and still feels pretty miraculous. Fast forward to now, he's going to university in September and the world is his oyster. Today, there are around 7,200 deaf children under the age of 5 in the UK who face a lifetime of disadvantage without access to early support. AV UK currently supports 80 families directly. The charity's ultimate goal is to enable all deaf children to have the opportunity to access AV therapy if their parents want their child to learn to listen and talk as we did. It is a small charity, and any donation will make a huge difference. To donate or learn more, please visit www.avuk.org. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers and rock stars of life. If I were to list the achievements, awards and accolades of my guest today, there would be no time left for me to have a conversation with him. In essence, he is a psychiatrist, neuroscience researcher, philosopher and literary scholar, an author and a thinker of extraordinary versatility, depth and originality. He is a Quondam Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, an Associate Fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford, a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and a former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at the Bethlem Royal and Maudsley Hospital, London. He has been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Baltimore, and a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. He has published articles and research papers in a wide range of publications on topics in literature, philosophy, medicine, and psychiatry. He is also the author of The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, and secondly, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. It is a huge honour and a little bit daunting to talk today to Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Iain, thank you so much for giving up your time today.
Oh, thank you very much, Katie. I'm thoroughly delighted to be here and able to talk with you.
Well, in one of your many discussions that I have listened to, you described life as a relay, and I particularly like that metaphor. So I'd like to take you back to the start of your run. How would you describe your family?
Well, not academic.
Right.
So for somebody who is fairly academic, my father was a GP. My mother was an artist who'd been the assistant curator of a museum before she married my father. And then she was a devoted mother. And I can't tell you how grateful I am to have everything she gave to my brother and myself. There were just the two of us. I'm the elder one. And my brother is an art historian and also writes books.
So you're both actually pretty academic.
Yes, we both got scholarships to Winchester College. We then got scholarships to Oxford. We then got first-class degrees. We won the prizes. And I went to All Souls, and he rather sensibly went to Italy and then to Greece, where he spent most of his life between those two countries with their wonderful cultures. Yeah.
You've studied at some of the most revered academic institutions on the planet, and you were awarded scholarships, as you say, to pretty much all of them, I think. And you said on the Ralston College podcast that of all of them, the single most profound and transformational educational experience you had was at Winchester College. What was it about Winchester that stood out?
Well, I was the first person in my family to have gone to a public school, so I didn't know what to expect. And what I found was something that I just lapped up and responded to very positively. And people often say, what was it they taught you. And of course, they did teach me an extraordinary amount. And I think at Winchester, certainly in those days, and quite possibly now still, standards were very high, not in a tyrannical way that you had to achieve, but you were open to do as much as you could, and you were encouraged to do more. And so it was a very encouraging, exciting academic atmosphere. But the thing that I most take away from it was a sort of culture, really, and a way of being, which was very largely due to my housemaster, who was a man called Martin Scott, a remarkable man. He's not terribly well known at all. He wrote a book on medieval European history, but he was far, far, far more than anything I could put into words. He was a lovely man. He was a family man. He had 4 children, and I'm still in touch with those children. He was something like a medieval abbot in appearance. He was large and rotund and almost always had a big smile on his face, and his hair had naturally formed a tonsure. So he was the most unstuffy man you could imagine. He was enormously clever, of course, and well-read, and he introduced me at an early age to many things, just lent me books saying, I think you'd enjoy this, and he was so right. So I picked up from him the love of poetry, which a lot of the books that he lent me were of, and a certain attitude, which is essentially not to take anything in this life that seriously, which is an odd thing to say, because he was a very serious man and he didn't belittle one's teenage angst, which of course I had. I think I take the world quite seriously, but what I want to convey is that at the back of it, there is a sort of sense of proportion or a sense of humour, and a way of putting things, which just I love so much, because I think my family were lovely people, but they were a bit serious.
I remember you saying that you'd go for walks with him. And in fact, it wasn't just him, it was other teachers as well, that you could go and knock on their door and say, I've got a question for you. I mean, that's unheard of, impossible in certain schools, but unheard of even in schools where you are all in the same place.
Yes, the dons, as they were called, were living in houses in the 17th century streets around the college. And we thought nothing of going, well, let's go and ask so-and-so, because he'll know the answer. Having absolutely no experience of what it's like to have a marriage and a family and preparing lessons. Somebody just turn up at the door and say, yes, what do you think of the scandal of particularity? That sort of thing. But anyway, we were very welcomed. And Martin Scott used to say, which is very nice, I'm going to take Sheba, his dog, out for a walk on the downs. You want to come with me? And we'd end up declaiming poetry, and it was very special.
Yeah, that sounds really magical. You had a scholarship to New College, and I always laugh when we talk about New College because it was new in 1379, and in 2025 it's not quite so new anymore. No. But it is thanks to them that we're having this conversation today. So why New College and why English?
New College because I had a great love of Winchester and was, in a very old-fashioned way, grateful to the founder, William of Wykeham, and faithful to the tradition. I loved tradition, which, of course, too often people misunderstand as some way of fossilizing things, whereas actually the whole word means the handing on of something. And there was a tradition in Europe for as long as you like, but it didn't mean that the culture ossified. In fact, it went through extraordinary changes, so that the history of ideas in Europe changed every 25 years, roughly speaking, even though there was an uninterrupted so-called tradition. Anyway, that was why I wanted to go to New College, and because the architecture was somewhat similar.
Oh, yes, of course.
You see, I was living in a medieval building with medieval cloisters and a medieval chapel. I thought, well, that will be New College. So that was really it. And I was told, because it was already beginning to happen, that New College didn't look with favour people from Winchester because it was thought that there was too much of that in the past. And so it would probably count against me. But anyway, it turned out it didn't. The subject was a bit odd because coming from a completely non-observant and non-religious family, I mean, I think my father thought the church was a little bit absurd. I had the idea that after leaving school and going to Oxford, I would probably take orders and or go into a monastery.
I grew up going to church and I still go to church and I get a lot from that. But I do know that if I was brought up in a Jewish family, I'd be going to a synagogue, and I probably would be continuing to do that. And if I was a Muslim, I'd be going to a mosque. I was interested that you had a clean sheet of paper and a very questioning mind, and that Christianity appealed to you. And I wondered what that was.
Yes, it did. A whole range of things, really. One is that Martin Scott, my housemaster, had an active faith. We went, at least to start with, for the first couple of years, we went to the college chapel twice a day, morning and evening. As I moved on, it was only the evening service, which was really rather lovely. It was just a service for the scholars who lived in the medieval building. And it was called preces, Latin for prayers. And we would go there and there would be a reading, which might be poetry, or it might be from the Bible, or it might be whatever, a hymn and some prayers. And it would take 10 minutes and that would round off the day. Sometimes it was Compline. I suppose, if I'm honest, the things that I found most irresistible and completely gobsmacking was I had never heard the extraordinary beauty of 16th century polyphony. I'd never heard Byrd, Tallis, Palestrina, Lassus, Monteverdi, all these things, Gibbons. I didn't know them. When I heard them, they spoke to me more emphatically than anything else has ever spoken to me in my life. Now, a lot of people will say, oh dear, well, it's all very well liking the aesthetics and so on, but that is to misunderstand what those aesthetics were. They were the way of speaking directly to me, and not just about something that was an ornament, that was central to life, absolutely central. It completely convinced me. And a lot of preaching wouldn't have convinced me. So it did. And then, of course, there was poetry. So around this time, I was discovering, under the tutelage of my teachers and Martin Scott, the 17th century religious writers such as Herbert and Donne and Traherne and Vaughan and all of that. And that struck me very forcibly as well. And Martin also lent me a copy of The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, I think when I was about 15. But that was a landmark in my reading. I mean, after I read that, I thought, first of all, what James is talking about is something very real and important, but also his way of approaching it is enormously approachable, is very amenable to my way of thinking. Those things, the presence of the architecture, my feel for the history of the place, which was steeped in a monastic feeling, which I could have rebelled against, but just felt was an inexhaustibly deep well, really. It's a bit odd, I know, but there it is. And ultimately, as I came to know more of more conventional Christian doctrine, I suppose what I would say is that the mythos of Christianity, a word I hasten to add, not in any way as a judgment on its veracity, but just that it is a myth, true or false, and that myth is, in my view, the most powerful view that I've ever heard. I've heard many wonderful stories and much wisdom from many traditions, but there is nothing like the myth of God becoming man and suffering and dying and taking matter and flesh up into the realm of the spiritual. However you understand it, to me, it is unequal as a story that strikes both one's heart and one's intellect. It's an intellectually deep picture, which can be unpacked as in the creed and so forth, but I'm not so keen on propositions. I think that religion is largely a matter of a disposition, and that when people get too tied up with propositions, they have their place, but then people can start factionally warring with one another over the silliest things, like, Christianity being split in the West for 1,000 years over the filioque clause in the creed. And really, honestly, does it matter who proceeded from what? This is one Godhead.
Yes. I diverted you because you were explaining how you came to choose English. I interrupted you.
No, not a bit. So my intention was, I didn't want to do just philosophy in the analytic American sense tied to politics and economics, partly because, at least at that stage and pretty much all my life, politics and economics have bored me stiff. But philosophy has really always been my love. And because I'd not done the physiology and so on. I couldn't really do PPP at Oxford, philosophy, physiology and psychology, which might have been quite suitable. So I wanted to do a new course they just started called Theology and Philosophy. And my tutors who interviewed me for the scholarship in the end were Tony Quinton for philosophy, John Bailey for English with Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R. son, Anglo-Saxon.
Yes, I mean, that was a pretty good pedigree.
Pretty good pedigree. And they all said, look, you can't do philosophy and theology. It's not an honours degree. For whatever reason, it just hadn't yet got that status. In any case, they said, obviously you love English, which was a subject I'd almost, not quite at random, but I could have done other things. But because philosophy wasn't a school subject, I thought, well, English, I love it. So they said, you're good at that, come and do it. So I did. And all that went very well. I loved having John Bailey for a tutor particularly. I had other good tutors.
John Bailey was married to Iris Murdoch.
Was indeed.
Did you meet Iris at all?
I did a number of times because they had a house out at Steeple Aston, and I remember being invited out there to lunches by them, which was fun. And I remember as a sort of rather callow 19-year-old saying to Iris, do you really think that people are as strange as they are in your novels? And she said, my dear boy, when you're my age, you'll realise they're much, much stranger than I can make them.
And probably after all your research now, you can confirm that.
Yes, I think she's probably right. But that was a lovely thing. And it's sort of a shame that John Bailey was always thought of as the husband of Iris Murdoch.
I know. That's awful that I've gone and jumped straight to that too.
No, but I mean, Iris was another great person. And they seem to have an odd and probably unfathomable relationship, but a rather kind and fond one. So that was good.
And why did John Bailey suggest that you apply to All Souls?
Yes, he did. I'd never thought of it. I knew there was this very strange, rather out of this world institution just over the wall from New College. And you could sort of peer through the rather beautiful ornate gates in Radcliffe Square and see this Holy of Holies. Nobody seemed to know who was there or be able to get into it. And he said, I think you should do this exam. I suppose the reason why he thought so was because, for example, there are a couple of English prizes, the Chancellor's Essay Prize and the Charles Oldham Shakespeare University Prize in English that I'd already got. And I think he thought that I was a good examinee, and I don't know. He believed in me, and I'm delighted that he did, and was delighted to be accepted. That was a bit of a high point for me.
There was something that you thought you were going to be examined, and they all stood up and clapped.
Oh, that was not the All Souls exam.
Oh, that wasn't? Okay.
No, that was my finals. So when I'd done my English finals, basically there were only two reasons for being called for a viva. One was that you were borderline and they wanted to know whether they could give you a degree or not. And the other was basically a rather old-fashioned thing to congratulate you. And I, of course, being always pessimistic about myself and believing that an imposter, I thought, well, this is not going to be, what have I done? How can I salvage this situation? So it was very nice to discover it was congratulatory, yes. No, the All Souls thing is quite other matter. It was a 3-day written exam. And I always enjoy these things, actually. I enjoy the challenge, but nonetheless, it had its nerve-wracking moments.
And then you were there at All Souls for 7 years, is that right?
Yes, they give you a 7-year fellowship, yep.
And what were you doing in those 7 years?
It's a very good question, and it's a question I asked myself. A not very good answer is that I wrote a book, my first book, which was published by Faber, and I think I'd finished writing it by the time I was 26, and it was published by the time I was 27, 28.
And what was that about, Iain?
Well, it was called Against Criticism. And you see, the thing is that my real passion all my life, to be honest, has been ideas. English was all very well, but in a way it was the ideas that came to me about it and through it. And interestingly, later in life, I became, in any case, it's always a very good idea for a psychiatrist to have his own therapy. And I did. And one of the things that I suppose I must have known at some level, but came with a bit of a surprise, was that ideas to me are very exciting, that ideas have a sort of charge to them, a vitality, a zing, an energy, that they're not just things to be debated and come up with. They're really important in the drive forward of life, I suppose. Anyway, that's just to say, I had been thinking there's something wrong with the way we study literature, because I just thought, look, something is missing. Every time we have a seminar and talk about a work of literature, it can be put fairly simply. It took me a long time to formulate exactly what it was, but I can say it very quickly now. It's that something that, if it's any good, is quite unique. So a great work of art is just itself. And if it hadn't existed, there'd be a hole in the universe, the shape of that work of art. Of course, this doesn't apply to poor works of art, which could be run off by the art. And we take this unique thing and then categorize it and say it's part of this and it's like that. So we put it in a category where it's no longer unique. The second thing is that everything in a work of art is contextual. Indeed, everything in life, as I now know, is contextual. Everything has to be understood in a context. But it's very particularly obvious with, say, a poem, because when you take a word or a phrase out of the context of the poem, or you take its meaning, in inverted commas, which is not really its meaning at all, but the paraphrase out of the context of the poem, it means something completely different. So you've lost something again. And the third thing really is that it's embodied and implicit. And so it resists being made explicit. As soon as you make it explicit, you've disembodied it. And a poem is not just an intellectual exercise, such as it appeared in Oxford in a seminar room. It was also something that, if you paid attention when you were reading a poem and you were reading it attentively, it could alter your blood pressure, your pulse rate. It could make the hair on your neck stand up. It alters your breathing. In fact, when you're reading, you don't realize it, but if it's verse, your musculature is relaxing and contracting in a rhythm that's generated by the verse. And so all these things are true, and very much more deeply, of course, it's not just about ideas. It's about feelings that are something very special. So once we've done all that, we've ruined it. So I thought there's something here that I need to investigate, and it's really about the mind-body problem. So I went to a lot of philosophy. I could go to any faculty seminars I wanted. It was very nice. I had all the time in the world, apart from writing a book. So I did, and I found the philosophers just too disembodied in their approach to this highly embodied question. And around that time, Oliver Sacks had published Awakenings, and that was another real milestone for me. I was so excited reading it, because here was the coming together of technical knowledge, professional skill, imaginative insight, the personal and the general, the embodied and the abstract. And this seemed like a very, very good place to go if you wanted to understand how a person's body and their mind relate. What happens when something changes in their body or their brain and it affects their mind? Or they develop some idea mentally that causes changes in their body. There was nothing for it, effectively, but to say goodbye to leading a life of pleasant, easy labour, I think, as an academic, and instead become the lowliest of the low, a first-year medical student, than which it is impossible to think of anybody less estimable, as I soon discovered.
Well, and you even went further back, because you had to redo A-levels and things, didn't you, to become...
I would have had to. The only one I had that was at all relevant was maths. All the others were in the humanities. But at that time, they started a new medical school in Southampton, set up by an Oxford academic who decided that there should be a place where medicine was perhaps more tied to mature students and to people who had made a decision to go into medicine, not just because they were good at the A-levels and it was the obvious next thing, give you a career that would make money, but really wanted to go into medicine for humanist reasons. And so that was very good. At that stage, there still was a course for a small number of us. I think there were only 12 in my year, in which we were beautifully brought up to speed in a matter of months to A-level standards for chemistry and biology. And then we could get into the full-time medical training, which I must say I loved. It was exhausting, but
Must have been.
very, very different from doing a degree in English. I spent a lot of time talking with friends and sitting on the lawn and reading and meditating. I didn't do any of that in the medical school. At 9 o'clock, I was in a lecture, and I was in a lecture until whenever I went to the lab and so on. So it was rather good, actually. And I felt slightly sorry for those who'd come straight out of school, just fresh from A-levels, because they never had any chance, really, to have the freedom of range, which I had, to exercise your mind over many, many subjects. During those 7 years, I found myself a Russian teacher. I learned about neurology because I was interested already in the brain and so on. I did all kinds of things as well as exploring philosophy. So for me, to have something like anatomy, which is extraordinarily beautiful, and where there is a right answer to a question, what is the innovation of this muscle? This was very new.
Yes.
Very refreshing.
Yes. Did you feel that your humanities background informed your medical learning?
I do remember one of the consultants on a ward where we were extraordinarily busy and where I was always already beginning to do night shifts and things as a student, saying, very good for you all to be reading novels, Dickens, and, I was thinking, well, fine, but this is rather like recommending intercontinental travel to an unmarried mother of 8. What good is this advice going to be? So I was incredibly happy to have learned. And I think the big difference it made was that I could see everything that was presented as just technical stuff as inevitably part of a philosophical vision of what we were doing. And it made it so much richer and so much more interesting. I always saw what I was doing as science used to be called natural philosophy. And that's what, in a way, it became for me. So I was immensely grateful to have done it in that order, but I don't think many people can really afford to do that. I was supported by my fellowship so that I could, but I was very lucky. And I do think there is an important coming together of these more philosophical ways of thinking, and perhaps illuminated by examples from literature, and the technical scientific thing. I have no word whatever to say against that. I think there is no excuse for not being technically absolutely up to the minute and knowing your stuff. And actually, there's a great deal of pride and pleasure in knowing your stuff and using it appropriately. But on the other hand, there is something to be gained from that bridge. And last year, I was asked to give a named lecture at Duke, the McGovern lecture, which was founded exactly for this purpose, to talk about the bridge between medicine and the humanities.
Was there any particular patient that you look back on and feel particularly proud of?
I don't know that I'd say that. I've been very touched to hear later from patients, not my psychiatric patients, but patients when, for example, I was working in the neuro centre in Southampton. Several patients have written to me since and said, you don't know, but you made a huge difference to my life. So I think that is something I would feel pleased to have been able to contribute. There is a moment that's slightly the opposite that I remember. It just shows you how extraordinarily fine judgments these things can be. So at this time, which would have been 1988, I was working in the Wessex Neuro Centre. I already had my wife and 2 children to look after. I have a 3rd daughter, but she wasn't born then. On this particular unit, I was working 120 hours a week, which is remarkable. I mean, nowadays it's not legal, but in those days it was. I don't know what I think about it. I think that it probably wasn't perfect for either doctors or patients. In fact, could be dangerous. But on the other hand, I think the fact that it's gone means that something has been lost, a sense of your complete subjection of your life to the service of the patient. Not that, well, I'm going home now, because you just bloody didn't.
Yes. Did you question it at the time, or you just did it?
I just did it, really. But it was difficult because on one night in 3, as well as working every day. And what that means is that night you wouldn't sleep. And you'd be very lucky if you got to lie down for half an hour, but that would be it. And then every third weekend, I would have been on the on-call team. So being a junior doctor, I would have been the first port of call for the staff if there was a problem. And one night there was, and they called me and said, Mrs. So-and-so has had a seizure. As you can imagine, on a neurology ward, this is not an unusual phenomenon. And there are protocols for dealing with it and so on. And there was something about the way I was being approached about this that made me wonder. And I said, do you think that this could be something worrying, or are you prepared to give her a dose of an anti-epileptic drug and see how she fares? And she said, well, I'm not entirely happy about it, actually. And I thought, gosh, what shall I do? I think I'd better ring the senior registrar, who was the next one below the consultant. And I rang him and I explained this, and he said, tell theatre to get ready, I'll be there in 10 minutes. I thought, fuck, I mean, excuse me.
No, yeah.
What? I mean, I was sort of like, And what I didn't know was that she had a condition called a colloid cyst of the third ventricle, which could potentially move into such a position that it obstructed the outflow of cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle. And that would cause expansion, which would put pressure on brain tissue and effectively could be life-threatening. So there are these moments when you do these things.
But actually, you did the right thing because you called the person above you and he dealt with it. So
I did, but I think the thing is that you're suddenly brought up against the fact that, yes, you've learned a lot, but you don't know everything by a very long way. And another thing, a more rewarding thing, was that I got very good at doing lumbar punctures, where you have to put a spinal needle between the vertebrae and draw off some fluid. And it's something that most people don't like the thought of. I used to have a number of these to do, I think every Friday morning, I seem to remember. I felt very, very happy when I had positioned a patient and put some local anaesthetic on, and we'd got a little vial of liquid, and okay, you can go back to the ward. And he said, but aren't you going to do it then? I said, look, here's the file, here's your CSF. So I felt, again, it's a kind of bond with the person that's on the other end of this experience, that you've been able to do it in a way that has not been traumatizing.
Yes.
And there were a few diagnoses I made that had been missed and saved people's lives, not specifically at that centre, but in the rest of my career. In the psychiatry, I met people who were on the psychiatric wards but had conditions that required physical medical treatment, and without it, they would have deteriorated. So I was very pleased about that. I made those decisions even as a junior doctor.
Then you have a sliding doors moment. I don't know if you've seen that film, Sliding Doors. You probably haven't had time.
Actually.
No, because you won't have had time to be watching. You had far more important things to be doing. But it's that moment when you could go one way or the other, and you changed tack. And ultimately, you write The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. What caused you to make that change?
Well, I was always interested in working in the overlap area between neurology and psychiatry. And in my training, one or two interesting things had crossed my mind, only one of which was mentioned, the others were glossed over in lectures. One was, okay, there's the brain, it's divided in two, as it were. Why? And nobody particularly had an answer to that. But it seems a pretty fundamental question, because the brain's power comes from making connections. So why have a whopping great divide? And by the way, it's even more divided before you get to mammals. There's really no major connection between the hemispheres. Birds, reptiles, and the early creatures, all those that have brains have this division. But it's only latterly that we begin to get this band of fibers called the corpus callosum. And indeed, it's getting more vestigial, smaller in relation to the size of the brain rather than larger. So that was an interesting thing. The second thing is I noticed that there were asymmetries in the brain, and they just said, oh, well, that's because language developed in this part of the posterior left hemisphere. And it's true, it is enlarged in that area on the left. But that can't be right, because great apes who don't have language, and we've tried very hard to teach them, also have that enlargement. It predated language. And also the most important asymmetry in the brain is actually in the right frontal cortex. And that was just completely glossed over because in those days, the right hemisphere wasn't really important. It didn't really do anything. It just propped up the left hemisphere. And so these were awkward questions. But the one that was mentioned by chance was that the traffic across the corpus callosum was largely inhibitory in its effect. Now, that really struck me. That is extraordinary. So you've got these two hemispheres there, not very much connected, but the bit they are connected, a lot of it is saying, no, you keep out of this while I deal with it. That's got to be significant. And around that time, I made a decision which changed my life, which was not to have a cup of coffee, but instead to go to a lecture that was advertised in the corridor at the Maudsley Hospital, where I was a doctor in training. The subject was the right cerebral hemisphere and psychiatric disorders, and I'd never heard anything about that. In those days, the left hemisphere did all the heavy lifting and the right hemisphere was a freeloader. So I thought, well, I must go and hear that. And it was by John Cutting, to whom I owe a great deal. Again, he had been thinking about issues to do with the difference between the hemispheres for a long time and had written a book called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders, published by OUP. And I read it and I talked to him actually after his lecture and said that was absolutely fascinating. The thing that particularly struck me was that in Against Criticism, I'd been trying to explain this problem in the study of literature whereby we made the implicit explicit, we made the unique general, and we made the embodied disembodied. And during this talk, he talked about the real differences between the cerebral hemispheres, which are nothing like the ones that pop psychology talks about. You don't have to forget all that. But three of the things he said really came home to me. One was the right hemisphere understands the unique case. The left hemisphere only understands the general category. Secondly, the left hemisphere understands implicit meaning and meaning in context, whereas the right hemisphere understands abstraction. So things are being categorized and removed from that context. And the third thing is that the right hemisphere is much more in touch with our embodied selves than the left hemisphere is. And I just thought, but those are the three things. And of course, the left hemisphere alone can speak. That is not the same as saying it alone has linguistic skills. Both hemispheres do, but speech is for 97% of people, right or left-handed, is in the left hemisphere. And so it was very difficult for my right hemisphere to talk about what my right hemisphere knew and was seeing. And I suppose the next, God knows how many years it was, that would have been in about 1990. And then in 1992, I was lucky enough to get this exchange fellowship at Hopkins and do neuroimaging on the asymmetry of the brains of people with schizophrenia, which was very interesting. And then I've largely researched and looked after patients and explored their cases and in some cases written them up. But it was a very long haul to go into a literature that a lot of it is neglected, denied, or whatever. But there it is, these beautifully written books, often from the first 60 years of the 20th century and perhaps the last decade or two of the 19th century, where neurologists in particular gave beautiful case studies, really detailed accounts, and not just numbers accounts, but conversations that they had with the patient and what the patient did. Took out a cigarette and put it in his ear or whatever it was. And I learned so much from this. And I'm so grateful to those people for the work they did. I knew that there was something very important here, but articulating it took me about, whatever it was, 20 years. And resulted in The Master and His Emissary, which I'm grateful to Yale for having the guts to take it on, because I wasn't a much storied, much famed author. I was somebody who'd published a book in his 20s and then, frankly, hadn't had any time to write because I'd been bringing up a family, I'd been a hospital doctor, I was working these incredible schedules and still trying to maintain my sanity and do a lot of research at night and at the weekends.
Yes. Well, it has received so much praise from so many quarters. And I'm just going to mention one piece of feedback from a famous reader, and that's John Cleese, who said, "I love this book above all others because it promises to help me understand paradoxes that have puzzled me all my life." I'd just like to quote, from your website about the book. So beautifully put. This book argues that the differences lie not, as has been supposed, in the what, which skills each hemisphere possesses, but in the how, the way in which each uses them and to what end. But like the brain itself, the relationship between the hemispheres is not symmetrical. The left hemisphere, though unaware of its dependence, could be thought of as an emissary of the right hemisphere, valuable for taking on a role that the right hemisphere, the master, cannot itself afford to undertake. However, it turns out that the emissary has his own will and secretly believes himself to be superior to the master, and he has the means to betray him. What he doesn't realize is that in doing so, he will also betray himself. In this book, you have grounded your argument in neuroscience, philosophy, metaphysics. I'm not even sure I fully understand all of those things myself. And I've watched the documentary that came from the book. But for those who are listening and not familiar with your work, could you just briefly explain your findings about how each side of our brain operates differently and why the problems that we see in the world today lie inside what you would term our modern brains? That's asking a lot, I know.
No, by now I should be able to do the elevator pitch, but it's surprisingly difficult to do without being misunderstood. But I think the first thing to say is that people should forget everything that they've heard about the differences because they're not true. And they were based on the idea of what the two halves of the brain do, which is the question we'd ask of a machine. If instead we'd ask the question, we'd ask of a person, in what way? How did they do this? We'd have found there was a general, very important, pervasive difference. And that difference boils down to two ways in which the hemispheres attend to the world. This has been known for some time, but nobody really twigged it, the significance of it. And I didn't twig it immediately. I thought, gosh, that's interesting. And then I realized attention is not just another cognitive function. Attention is how we dispose our consciousness to the world. And how we dispose our consciousness to the world affects what we find there. If we go with a certain clinically detached attention and we attend to it because we see there something that will be useful to us or make us powerful, we'll see one thing. Whereas if we attend to it in a more open spirit of generosity to see what is here, what kind of thing this is, it might be different from what I anticipate, then we see something else. So that's it broadly. Now, why does this matter? It matters because this kind of difference of attention is based on a drive which is ancient and evolutionarily ineliminable for any creature, which is how to eat and how to stay alive. In order to eat, you have to grab stuff quickly. It might just be a seed, or it might be a rabbit, or it might be a twig to build a nest. It doesn't matter. But you've got to get it precisely, quickly, and manipulate it to use it. And so the emphasis is on a detail which is brought into very sharp focus. The trouble with paying that kind of attention is that's all you see. And if that's all you see, you soon become somebody else's lunch while you're getting your own. So it's very important to have wide open, unfocused in that sense, broad, vigilant, sustained attention to everything without any conclusion as to what might be there. You see, the left hemisphere knows what it is. It's a seed, it's a rabbit, I've got to get it. Whereas the right hemisphere is saying, Ramachandran, a rather well-known neuroscientist who interestingly likes my work, says the right hemisphere is the devil's advocate. And the devil's advocate is going, hang on a minute, you quick and dirty left hemisphere. It might be something else. And it's in those cracks that are opened up that the real richness of life comes in. So the right hemisphere is seeing the whole picture, which is making sense, whereas the left hemisphere has only one goal, which is getting. And I sometimes make a distinction between apprehension in the left hemisphere, grasping onto something, and comprehension in the right hemisphere, drawing things together so that they make sense. And the reason this matters is that these are two visions of how the world works. That of the left hemisphere is that it's made up of pieces. These pieces can be put together by us in a way which makes sense to us. Those pieces are decontextualized. They're general in nature, like the parts of a machine. They are completely divorced from the living entity which they were part of when we first looked. They are fully explicit. They are just what you see. What you see is what you get. There is nothing subtle about them, and they are constantly fixed in a way that won't be changed. So in the left hemisphere, the vision is of things that are static, fixed, easy to grasp, easy to manipulate, can be put together in ways where they make sense to us and leave us somewhat better off in terms of material goods or power. And that is effectively it. This vision of the world is like a map. So in the way a map is not moving in the way the world is, and it's schematic in a way the world isn't, and doesn't have all the information about all the people who live in the houses and the trees, and it just has, this is where we are, that's where it is. The left hemisphere view is as skeletal as that, basically. Very, very useful. There's a reason why we have maps. They're very helpful. But the problem is when you mistake the map for the territory, or as I prefer to say, the terrain. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere is seeing a completely different kind of world in which everything is ultimately connected to everything else. Nothing is isolated. Nothing is ever entirely fixed because it's constantly flowing. My favorite philosopher, Heraclitus, famously said, everything flows. It also sees things in context. It sees their implicit meaning. The right hemisphere sees all those things that really matter to us. I mean, the simplest is the meaning of a joke, which once made explicit kills the joke. Yeah. The poems are like that too. Once they're explained, they're dead. And all the things that really matter to us, like love and even sex and friendship and art and music and architecture and poetry and rhyme and myth and ritual and faith, all these things are diminished when they're made very explicit. So the left hemisphere doesn't understand that. It doesn't see what it doesn't see. It doesn't see what it's missing, you see. That's the problem. So the right hemisphere sees an animate world and a real world, which is not like a map, not a representation, but the real thing presencing. Now, that's a very quick attempt to canter through it. But that, if you think about it, has massive implications for how we imagine the world in which we find ourselves to be. And for various reasons that are interesting, and I explore a bit in the second half of The Master and His Emissary, we have moved, I think, towards a world in which we have failed to listen to or attend to what the right hemisphere knows and can tell us, and instead go only with the picture given by the left hemisphere. I suggest that this has happened twice before, that it is a recurring pattern, that it happened in Greece in the 6th century BC. There was an enormous efflorescence of the arts, of sciences, of everything together. Again, perhaps around the year dot in Rome, again in the Renaissance in modern Europe. And in each case, eventually that civilization drifted more and more into technical, bureaucratic, law-bound, hierarchical, uncreative ways of being compared with how it had been.
Do you feel sort of educationally, I mean, we're narrowing everyone's field to just focus on core subjects and de-emphasizing drama, music and art. Nowadays, there is sort of a movement towards passing exams. I'm a maths teacher, and the boys would always say, is this going to be in the exam? And I think, well, no, it's not going to be in the exam. It's just actually quite a bit of fun. But we're all obsessed with that. And I guess you're exercising the left hemisphere by dealing with those core subjects and giving more and more facts. And does that mean that we're strengthening the left hemisphere by focusing on that? That's probably very simplistic.
Well, I think there is a positive feedback loop, in other words, yes. That the more one thinks like this, the more one carries on thinking that way to the exclusion of everything else. And it's all there in that amazing word core, these core subjects. For me, what's at the core of education is the humanities. The key's in the word. Excuse me, I'm not a machine. I am a human being. These are not dispensable. These are essential subjects. I'm not saying that the so-called STEM subjects are not important. In the case of mathematics, it's rather different because that is a philosophical and imaginatively different kind of a subject. But technology and the way most science is studied these days is a matter of learning procedures and facts and thinking in schematic ways. Whereas the education that we should be offering people comes from opening their imagination, not in just some wild way towards fantasy, but towards what is I argue, the opposite of fantasy, which is imagination, the only chance we have to get into the true, the real. And this is very much what Wordsworth and Coleridge argued for at the beginning of the 19th century, and they were so right. That has not been surpassed. And I think what we need is to be able to put back into the curriculum at least literature, poetry, drama, at least some history, quite a lot of it, some languages, that you understand other cultures. Learning a language is just not a way of getting around on the bus when you're in a certain country. Not only does it open you to the literature of that country, which is not the same in translation, particularly if it's poetry, but it actually, as I discovered, opens another way of thinking or being. Not really thinking, it does that as well. But the most important thing is it opens another way of being in the world.
Yes.
As I wrote in my early book, Against Criticism, there is no complete equality between the French saying, j'ai envie de manger, and the Englishman saying, I could do with something to eat. So
I understand.
There's a whole way of being and thinking that comes with the language as well. So all I'm really saying is, yes, I think this is a catastrophe for us. I think it's not too strong. I don't know if this news is yet public, but I don't think it will cause any waves if I mention the fact that I'm been very proud to be offered and have accepted being the Chancellor of Ralston College in Savannah, where I delivered the 3 Sophia lectures last year. And this is a venture which is utterly thrilling. I mean, when I went there, I met such lovely, clever young people that were not hidebound in their opinions, could think flexibly, were rounded in their education, and were immersed in the old studies that would have been the core of anybody's education at a university in the past, even if that was science. So I think this is a thing that has to happen. And the trouble with this way of thinking is that it has been externalized in AI. There's so much that could be said about that. But what I wanted to do in The Matter with Things, which was the book that came out, I think, in 2021, and which was a very, very long piece of work, is that I wanted to really show how the world would look if you took seriously the neuroscience. And then I asked people, how are we going to get nearer to truth? I think science is a good idea. Yep. Reason. Yep. Intuition, yeah, maybe. Imagination, I don't know about that. But anyway, I show how actually they're all very, very important. And when you begin to apply what we know and how untrustworthy the left hemisphere's vision when you encounter it, and you can easily recognize it, it's the typical picture of reductive scientific materialism. It's all just stuff bumping around with no meaning or value or purpose. But I was surprised to find towards the end of that book, I was writing chapters on value and chapters on purpose. And I'm terribly pleased to report that having lagged 100 years behind physics, biology is now at last stopping this ludicrous pretense that you can't talk about purpose in biology. I mean, if you can easily talk about it in the inanimate universe, you can talk about it in the animate one as well.
Yes. Well, I'm reading The Matter with Things, and just I would recommend to all listeners to buy the book. I've also listened to your discussions, all of them, with Alex Gomez-Marin, physicist and neuroscientist.
Really? Oh, gosh, well done. Thank you.
In fact, my husband said, I feel like 2 men I don't know have moved into my house because I was always listening to you. But I was completely absorbed. And it was actually a lovely way to understand the book. And I was really concentrating to try and keep up with you too.
Oh.
But in your introduction, you say, this book is an attempt to convey a way of looking at the world quite different from the one that has largely dominated the West for at least 350 years. Some would say as long as 2,000 years. I believe we have systematically misunderstood the nature of reality and chosen to ignore or silence the minority of voices that have intuited as much and consistently maintained that this is the case. Now we have reached a point where there is an urgent need to transform both how we think of the world and what we make of ourselves. Attempting to convey such a richer insight is the ambition of the book. And it's in 2 volumes. It's 1,500 pages, I think, of detailed research, analysis, thinking. It's taking what you've learned and written about in The Master and His Emissary and expanding on it. And we've got about 15 minutes to discuss it now. So I was trying to think of a word that was going to quite sort of grasp the undertaking that it must have been. There isn't one that I can come up with. How did you keep going?
Well, I mean, first of all, I should perhaps just mention, so as people don't enter a state of despair, that actually it's only 1,200 pages of text.
Sorry.
It has quite broad margins. The last 300 pages are bibliography and index.
I've been reading on my Kindle, so I don't know about
yes,
that.
fair enough. Yes. But the pleasure of the hard copy is that it has lovely margins, and the notes are all in the margins, so you don't have to flick to the back or anything.
Okay.
You just pick them up. But in any case, how did I do it? Undoubtedly with great difficulty. And people always say, I'm surprised because it doesn't read like that. But the reason it doesn't read like that is because I spent a lot of pains on it.
Yes.
I suppose it wasn't so bad with this book. With The Martian's Emissary, I couldn't get started because I didn't know what shape the book would be. And it was only latterly that it sort of fell into shape. With this one, I could sort of see what I was doing, really. But once I got going on it, a combination of a sort of excitement and something that's very hard to describe, but is almost like being driven or ridden by a demon. I have said this, and I think it's fair, that you don't have any alternative, really. In a way, the more you've written, the more you've got to carry this process on.
Yes.
And so I wanted to get through it before I died. And so I prioritized it over everything. I suppose it took me about 7 years to write, which is a lot shorter than The Master and His Emissary. But then at that time, I was working in 50, 60 hours a week.
Wow.
And fitting it in around that. Whereas with this, I was a full-time writer and speaker. And so I was just very rigorous, really, and a bit inflexible. I'd sit at my desk and no, you can't go out now. You have to write now and keep going until at 6 o'clock I usually knocked off unless it was incredibly exciting that I just needed to carry on. But yes, it was like that. It was like, no, I'm sorry, you've got to do this, whether you feel like it or not. I sort of said to myself, is this wise? If this was a patient talking to you and they said, I feel very tired, actually, and I don't really know whether I can do it. Why are you doing this to yourself? Yes, physician, heal thyself.
You have managed to distill a lot of very complicated research and concepts, and for the likes of me to grasp most of it, which that's a skill in itself. But I was describing it to a friend of mine. It's like having sort of cataracts, and then suddenly you would put forward an argument and it would be like the cataracts falling away and you think, oh yes, I can see that now. That makes absolute sense. I would urge everyone to read it, listen, and it tackles consciousness, attention, purpose, value, intuition. And I've got 5 specific questions, which are just to give listeners, well, and also selfishly me, a flavour. And they're not the biggest topics by any means. They're just things that I thought, oh, that's so interesting. So if you don't mind, we'll just run through those.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first was time. And as we get older, we all feel that time speeds up. And you gave a really insightful reason for why that happens. And I was wondering if you could explain.
Yes, there are a number of reasons, I think. The main one is that in childhood, everything is fresh. I mean, ultimately, every experience is unique. And so a child, when it's beginning to speak, finds the excitement of going, doggy, because it remembers a thing like that is called a doggy, so it goes in a box called doggy. There's lots of these. There's not just one. And actually, when my children were learning, just got doggy, cats were also doggy. I think on occasion birds were doggy as well. But generally speaking, when you're a child, every experience is fresh. And this is what Wordsworth wrote about so movingly in the Prelude and in the Ode on Intimations of Immortality on Recollections of Early Childhood, that he saw life with fresh eyes. And so nothing was ever dull. It wasn't the cast of familiarity, the veil of familiarity had not been thrown over experience and turned it dead. As a result, rather like when you go away somewhere new, and it may only be for 3 days, you think, have we only been away 3 days? It feels like at least a week. I mean, that's a good demonstration of how when experience is new, it dilates. And when it's familiar, same old, it just whizzes by and leaves you cold. Talk about 4 possible ways in which this happens, but that's probably the main one. The importance of that is that it's ceding place to the left hemisphere's take. And what Wordsworth was writing about was that his right hemisphere was alive and the world presenced to him. It wasn't just represented to him somehow later in a picture. Oh, picturesque landscape, tick, done that one. No, he could actually look at a waterfall or a rock even and just go, I'm awestruck. We've lost that, yeah.
Yes.
But we can recover it.
Yes. Second one, imagination and creativity. And again, this I found really fascinating. And of course, I'm relating it to me. So I've been writing books, novels for teenagers, yet to be published. And I'm not holding my breath for that, but I'm enjoying the process anyway. But I will set myself a certain amount of time every day. And say if it's 2 hours, it will be typically, not always, it would be like wading through treacle for the first 1 3/4 hours. And then the last 10, 15 minutes when I basically give up and think, well, that was a waste of time. And why are you even thinking you're bothering? And why do you think you can even do this? Then just write down some things so that then the next day, any old idea I may pick up. And it's in those last 15 minutes that things really start working. But if I just did 15 minutes, it wouldn't work. But those 15 minutes really work. Or it's later when I'm taking the dog for a walk or I'm doing something else when I'm not even thinking about it, that my best ideas will come when I'm not sitting down. But I still have to sit down for it to happen, I think.
Yes.
So my question to you is why?
Well, I think the problem is that when we are consciously, effortfully trying to think about something, we are engaging the left hemisphere, trying to capture something that we think is important. And when it does that, it narrows the beam of attention. So it looks at the things where it might be expected to find something. Slightly like the story of the person searching for their keys under the spotlight. Where did you drop them? Over there. I can't look over there because this is where the spotlight is. So that is slightly what happens. And this is famously the way in which both artists and scientists reach their conclusions. There's a very distinguished microbiologist or geneticist called George Gaylord Simpson who said, almost never, and he's a mainstream scientist, almost never did scientists make their discoveries by following the scientific method, which is not to say there's no point in it. I mean, it has its place at times, but it's usually not then that you make your discoveries. It's famously later Poincaré understood a mathematical concept after he'd stopped everything. He'd worked on it for 2 weeks. He was completely knackered. And he thought, I'm going into town. And when he was coming back and he put his foot on the bus step, he suddenly saw what it was. There are many, many stories related after them in the book. But I think what needs to happen is that the attention relaxes. And famously, it's then that and it's slightly like the more pedestrian thing of the tip of the tongue effect. The more you try, the more you don't get it.
Yes.
And then when you stop thinking about it, I know it's so-and-so, yeah. So it's a little bit like that, I think. But I think it's a very important aspect. And again, you see Wordsworth very well about this. He wrote about how the mind must strive to order these things and think about them and create and so on. But the actual thing won't happen then, but it won't happen later if you hadn't done that earlier. Yeah. So it's like an investment you make and then you give up on it. And this is very like, sorry, I'm taking up too much time here, but it's very...
No, you're not. Not for me. This is wonderful for me.
Oh, okay. Actually, very importantly, the way in which the hemispheres do relate. So another thing that I often say, so forgive me if you heard me say this, is when you learn a piece of music, you're initially attracted to it as a whole. You try to play it as a whole. And that's the right hemisphere having a sense of the gestalt, of the overall unfragmentable whole. But as you start to practice, you learn that you really do have to break it up into passages and practice them over and over and analyze the structure. I see, this is where we go back to the dominant and all that. And then when you go on stage to perform, you must forget all of that. If that obtrudes at all, you can't perform. But you had to do it to get the other place. So it's
Yes.
then taken up again by the right hemisphere, which sees the whole, and now you have an enriched picture. And that is really what's happening, is that you have an idea of something that's rather vague at the moment. You then strive to do something with it. It doesn't work. But then later, the moment where the gestalt emerges happens, but it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't gone through, or it might, but it's very unusual that it would happen without that intermediate step.
Brilliant. Third one is intuition, and former guest on the show, Loretta Ferrucci. She's a teacher, healer, author, inspirational lady. And she says, in order to live a full and joyful life, it's important to feed ourselves well. Physically, because nutrition matters. Mentally, because what we allow into our minds matters. Emotionally, because acknowledging feelings matter. Spiritually, because we are all spiritual beings having a physical experience. And a lot of her work is trying to reconnect people with their intuition. You told the story of the man who makes odds on the horses, and I was wondering if you could explain the intuition piece.
I mean, intuition is so important that, like science and reason, I devote 3 chapters to it in the new book. And I do think that it's one of the worst mistakes we can make to dismiss intuition. And intuition's had a bit of a bad rap since some clever psychologists pointed out that sometimes our intuitions can lead us astray. That's not news, actually. Sometimes reasoning can lead us astray very badly, into delusions, in fact. That's what happens in psychosis. People reason perfectly well. As Chesterton said, the madman has not lost his reason, he's lost everything but his reason. His intuitions might have saved him from some very ridiculous ideas. So intuition is a very important part, and it's able to maintain perhaps as many as a dozen different strands of thought at the same time, whereas once you explicitly speak it out, you can only deal with one at a time. Which reason many people working in a host of different realms, including management of firms and science labs, are suggesting that we should all encourage our colleagues and friends and employees to use their intuition about ideas and not just accept that, well, this is what I'm told. If your intuition says it might be wrong, it might be wrong. It might not, of course.
Yes.
Famously, there are things that are not intuitive that are true. But the reason that they mislead you when they do is because 99% of the time, they're going to be very useful. So if you do without them at your peril, I make the analogy to optical illusions, which you can't believe some of them. I mean, there is one, the checkerboard illusion, that I know it so well. Every time I look at it, I can't believe it. On the other hand, I never knew anyone who came away from this experience by saying, well, that does it. I'm never going to trust my eyesight again. So you need your intuitions. And the story of several people sent me stories. There's the one about which is slightly different, about embodied instantaneous, incredibly precise knowledge of the TT races in the Isle of Man. This was a Frenchman who settled in England and who had a very analytical mind. He said, I'm rather left hemisphere by training, and I studied the horse at university, and I've bred horses and raced them all my life. And then he now tips horses, i.e. he watches them just for 30 seconds to a few minutes, really not more than 5 minutes, and then is supposed to make an assessment of how likely they are to win a race and put odds on them. And he discovered that he was naturally getting this right, but when he came to report them to the bookmakers, he just lost his nerve. He just thought, why did I say that? That can't be right. And then he changed it. And he'd always change it away from what had been right. And eventually the bookmaker said, look, just write them down and send them. Please don't think them at all. And he now makes a very good living, but he discovers that it's only good if he's not overthinking it. And he doesn't do better than chance if he's got his son with him, who's very interested, because his son wants to know why he thought that. And then, of course, he changes his mind.
All sorts of areas of life that happens. Even if it's when you meet somebody, you have an immediate opinion and then you took yourself out of it, and then what you thought initially was absolutely right.
Very often. As with everything, occasionally it's not right. That's obvious. But so often it is right. And there's big literature on this in psychology, in academic psychology, and I quote a lot of the studies about how people make decisions instantaneously that are very good and then revise them and make them worse.
Yes, yes. Okay, number 4, which is happiness. And a psychologist told me recently that the number one way to make yourself happy is to help someone else.
Like that.
You quoted a statistic that today's school children of a certain age express anxiety, depression, and loneliness at a level diagnosable that is 4 or 5 times as high as children 100 years ago. Why do you think that is?
Obviously, there's a lot of things I could say, but let me try and keep it brief. Tied to the helping others, I think very often one practical way you can help people who are depressed, provided they're not morbidly depressed in the sense that they're unable to sleep or eat, or, I mean, that's another matter. But if effectively feeling down and that their life doesn't mean anything, one of the most valuable things you can possibly ask them to do, if they've got the energy to commit to doing it, is helping other people and joining a little voluntary thing where they're working with others and sharing a job, and get that immediate sense that actually something they're doing does matter, at least to some people. So I think that's right. I mean, there's a vast literature on happiness, and it can be boiled down to principally 3 things. Closeness in a social group, where you can trust people, where you can share your life with them, where you can share your meals with them, where you can worship them, where you can expect that they will help you out if you're in difficulty, and you would expect to help them out if they are. Now, increasingly, people don't live in that kind of still cohesive, living, organic kind of society, but it is the only place we can thrive. So it's a very serious loss through all kinds of things like fragmentation, by technology, by industrialization, having caused people to move away from the places where their home was for countless centuries. Immigration, I'm not going to be afraid to say that. It means cultures come into conflict, and you don't know that people share your values. And quite often they don't. They actually want to destroy yours. So it's not easy. So these are all part of that one. Secondly, closeness to nature, which is not, as I often say, the environment, which suggests something technical around you, but it's actually what is in you and you are in it. It means what is always about to be born, and it is the living world, which is our only home. And we don't live close to nature. Very few people do. And if they do, they don't get to spend much time in it. And if they do, they're too wedded to a machine that will go off in their pocket and so on. So you really have to make an effort to reconnect. And I guess the third thing is closeness to the divine, to the sacred, about which I write the last chapter in that book. And I try to be fair to it, and it cost me more pains than anything I've ever written. But the reward has been, however, many people have written to me saying, I never understood what people meant when they said they believed in a God. Now I understand more. Or I lost my faith. Now I think I've come back to it. Or people who are in their faith who said, this is exactly what I would always, who are priests or monks or whatever, or Buddhist sages who said, this is what I would have wished to convey. It's been very rewarding. I gave out a great deal for a very long time, but people are giving me back the bread I cast on the waters, which is a lovely thing.
You talk of life as a flowing whole, that we're all part of a single consciousness. And in fact, I had a former guest on the show, Ben Goldsmith, who lost his daughter in a tragic accident when she was a teenager. And he went to search for meaning, to find some acceptance, really. And he ended up taking ayahuasca to see if that was going to help. And he ended up writing this book, God is an Octopus. And what he means by that was that in that moment, he felt that he understood what life was about, and that we were all connected, life, death, the plants, the animals, human to human. It's all one great big flowing whole, which is, as you describe it, it's a very gentle and wonderful concept which again, as I said before, just makes so much sense.
Yes, I'd like to read that book, by the way. I've heard of it.
Oh, I'll send it to you. It's a beautiful book, actually. I'll send it to you.
Honestly, please don't. I won't show you around my room how the piles started being everywhere around the edges. Now they're coming into the middle of the room. There are literally hundreds of books just on the floor in this room, and my library is somewhere else. But anyway, the thing is, just one thing I'd like to say about that is, yes, all is one, but all is also many. And that is the beauty of the cosmos. when I was young, I'm so old that I remember people going around, man, all is one. And I'd say, yeah, and all is many. Now what, And I think it's really, really important to hold both of those. And if you persevere with the matter of things, you'll see how I make that an important topic for the first 2 chapters in the last part, where we're trying to get a hold on what the world is like. Because I think it's these 2 complementary forces of union and division that are so important. And so many great philosophers have made this point. So, yes, we are all one, but that doesn't annihilate our individuality. And our individuality doesn't insist on being severed from anybody or anything. But we shouldn't lose the one with the other, because this unfolding of uniqueness is part of the purpose, I believe, of the being of cosmos. And it then can be reintegrated, if you like, into another further enriched whole, like a bud that opens, and all that opening of stamens and petals seems to sort of, is that getting rid of the bud? Well, no, it's making the flower richer. And so you go on with ever returning waves of distinction and union.
I listened to Dr. Jonathan Rowson, the co-founder of your publisher, Perspectiva Press, and he said how reading your book had changed him. And I'm sure lots of people have said how it's changed them. And I can imagine I shall be dipping in and out of your book for the rest of my life. How has it changed you?
I've been asked that. You sort of expect in a kind of sequential way that it would. But of course, nothing is really sequential in that way. And it's not serial. Like you start here and then you work for, oh, now I know lots more. And you do learn, of course, or at least you deepen the understanding of what you thought you knew. So I think I do understand my relationship with the divine better with time. I have generally over my life. But what do I know? I mean, what does any of us know about it? Because at the end of all such exploring, it's not, now I've got it, but what do I really know? But it's not like ignorance. It's that unknowing that the Oriental sages speak of, which comes after knowledge, not the ignorance that comes before it. But I suppose that 1 or 2 differences in emphasis. I was actually genuinely surprised that there were going to be chapters, one on values and one on purpose. But I thought, no, they're so important that they really need to be there. And I think what has changed me is the way in which I see life. And this is a question that was raised by Iain Whitehead, the philosopher from whom I've learned so much. Well, actually, that's not quite true. I don't think it's that I've learned from him, because I discovered him so late that my philosophy was largely formed then. But when I did, I just found so many resonances with what I myself was thinking that I have used him as a way of saying, I'm not the only freak who thinks this kind of thing. So, but he asked the question, why is there life? And the sort of conventional answer is that it's a battle for persisting in existence. That, as he points out at the start, well, if you want to persist in existence, the thing is not to be alive. I mean, if you're a rock or a mountain, you might last billions of years.
Yes.
And then if you look back in evolution, we haven't seen it go towards more and more long-lasting species. It's gone towards more and more short-lived species. There are actinobacteria at the base of the ocean, single examples of which are 1 million years old, but we may be 70, 80, 90 or 100 if we're lucky. So it can't be that. And I think that what it is and why so much energy has been put into producing life, because just think about it, life is a very energy consumptive business. I think that what God, the source of everything, the ground of being, the ontological primitive, the Tao, the Li, Allah, whatever it is, I think this wants relation as the first thing. And I argue in that book, and you've probably seen that right from the first, even from the introduction, actually, that I argue that everything, it comes out of a relation. And the relations are prior to the things that are related, which some people find a bit difficult to get, but actually it's quite easy. And God, or whatever you call the ground of being, I have no objection to God unless it conjures in people's minds all sorts of negative ideas. But whatever that supreme entity is. It is relational, and it needed something to relate to. And the inanimate universe was a first step. And out of that, the living universe has come. And I believe indeed that there isn't a hard and fast line. There's a great difference in kind between the inanimate and the living, of course, but they're not ultimately entirely separate from one another. And that perhaps the whole cosmos is, in a sense, alive. But that means being able to respond to the great drives that I think caused the ground of being to create at all, a desire to see something come into being that is differentiated, that can respond, and responds to the values that describe that divine essence. And they are, I believe, and here I think Plato was right, truth, beauty, and goodness. I believe we are called to respond to these things. In a way, you can imagine a shrew in the garden can possibly understand something beautiful. Perhaps a bee can understand something beautiful. Goodness and truth, slightly less. But as we go up the so-called tree of life, you find that higher animals, dogs, never mind primates, have quite a highly developed moral sense and realize obligations to help. They understand unfairness and so on. So they have those things. And possibly it's only we who can talk about truth. But animals experience it. We can talk about it. But it's very important that in being able to talk about it, we don't betray it. We don't get it wrong. And at the moment where we stand in the West in 2025, I believe we are in danger of travestying each of these three great values, and truth in particular.
How hopeful are you?
I'm a dyed-in-the-wool pessimist, but I am quite hopeful. And I think the things are different. So being a pessimist is just saying, looking at it, things are going badly wrong, which they are. My reasons for optimism, that I do believe that humanity is far, far more than the story that is being sold to it now by people who I think have a very damaged and damaging vision of what humanity is, effectively a defective machine that can be improved by living forever or having a bigger memory. But that is not what we are. Really delusional and actually very damaging. So I think there is, perhaps particularly amongst young people, a feeling that they've had enough of this and they don't believe it. And that, unfortunately, can push them into the arms of magic and slightly dubious sorcery. But it can also, the evidence is this is happening, get them to realize the beauty and the richness of the established spiritual traditions and to want to align themselves with them and even to begin to return to celebration of them. So that is very hopeful to me. The fact that, generally speaking, when things go too far in one direction, there is a counter movement. The trouble is that AI may interrupt this process by controlling what we can think, and I don't want even to think about that, but provided we don't allow that to happen, in a sense, the worse things get, the better they get. Because while they were just fine, people became highly materialistic.
Yes.
Started to lose the sense of the awesome nature of existence. As things are getting tougher, more worrying, more real and gritty in certain sense, people are waking up. And waking up is no bad thing because we haven't got that long on this earth. And being alive to it is pretty important while you can. And doing those things that I was just talking about, responding to what is and helping to grow what is good and true and beautiful. So I am hopeful, yes. The last thing we should be doing at this stage is giving up. I'm still doing the bit that I can. I feel like I've probably said all I can say, but maybe not. I don't know.
Having finished this book, you have so many calls on your time to be speaking. I think is it in Australia?
I've been asked to go and talk to clergy in Australia, and when I come back, I'm going to LA, then I'm going to Aspen for a conference on consciousness, then I'm going straight to Hungary to give a talk at a big congress there, then coming back and teaching a 1-week residential course in Devon, and then I hope to go to Greece, because already this year I have turned down the Bahamas and Barcelona, but I did go to Norway and Poland. And as soon as I came back, I was invited by senior judges in London to address them, which was very interesting. But what I love is that all constituencies, whatever their profession, including people like economists with whom I thought I had nothing in common, tell me, no, your stuff is very interesting to us. So if my theory is right, then of course it matters for literally everything.
It is. Thank you so much for today. You've been absolutely wonderful.
It was a pleasure, Katie.
I've loved listening to you and picking and choosing my chapters, and I will continue to do so. And it really has changed. I was thinking when I was saying it's changed me. My husband, Simon, had a great friend, Jeff, and they would be in university together. And Jeff would go home and be told off about drinking and being too full of himself. And he'd come back and say, I've changed. And then they'd go to the pub for half an hour and he'd change back again. So I hope I've changed properly as a result of your book, but I will be continuing to read it, I think, for the rest of my life. So I urge listeners to read it.
Those are lovely words.
Well, we'll put everything in the show notes so that people know how to get hold of Channel McGilchrist and your work. But I've been really looking forward to talking to you, and it has been a real honour and joy to speak to you today, Iain, and you've been so kind. Thank you.
Well, Katie, it's been a huge pleasure, and I'm glad we managed to find a slot at last when we could do it.
We did, and I'm really sorry that I extended the slot, but you've been wonderful. Thank you, Iain.
No, I mean, it takes two, as they say, so there we are. Yes.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to all of the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.